I am going to take us a little more global, and also play a game of being both global and related to a very distant part of the world, and that is South Africa. That was the question. We've been talking about the Millennium Development Goals, and Goal 8 was develop a global partnership for development. And within that, more specifically, Target 8E is cooperation with pharmaceutical companies to provide access to affordable essential medicines in developing countries. And that's the question I have. We have that as a Millennium Development Goal, and I'm rather skeptical. And I'll explain why. Generally, access to essential medicines, we're talking about medicines for developing countries, not the developed world, although the Essential Medicines Program of the World Health Organization would probably do quite good to bring prices down even here. But I'm going to focus in South Africa in particular, and particularly in the context of HIV/AIDS, which I'll get to. And this is partly what drove me into this area, because it was explained the different things I do. I actually got to this through constitutional law and property rights and land, and eventually found myself having to deal with patents, because patents are a form of property. And then, of course, in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis in South Africa, got interested in this. And when I started out in this, back in the early 90s, this is the picture that was faced by South Africa. If you look at this, this is what the death rate for 15 to 34-year-olds would have been between 1980 and 2025, the little yellow dots in South Africa, coming from a period of violence and going to what would be a normal society. And then the red bars is what we're looking at with an HIV/AIDS pandemic. Well, what is the context in which we're working? At least from the legal perspective, we're working in the context of intellectual property, patents. The Paris Convention was the initial structure for that. And the Paris Convention is originally from 1884. So this is not a new development. It's been in place for a long time. But the Paris Convention, very importantly, only provided for national treatment. In other words, you can have whatever patent law you want in your country. You can decide to give no patent rights. And as long as you treated all others who come from outside, multinational companies, etc., the same. That was the law in place internationally right until 1994. Right? So what's important is to understand this whole dramatic change I'm going to talk about is actually very recent. Historically, the idea was if you want to provide patent protection for pharmaceuticals, that's fine. And in many parts of the world, particularly when it came to medicines, the kind of patent protection that was given was only in relation to what's called process patents. In other words, you get protection for how you produce the particular chemical compound that was the medicine, rather than protection on the product itself. And I'll talk about that in a little while again. In 1967, they formed the World Intellectual Property Organization, which had as its task as a UN-related body to promote intellectual property protection around the world. In fact, until that point, we never spoke about intellectual property. We spoke separately about patents, which was industrial property, copyright, which was artistic rights, and trademarks. These were very different forms of property. But the advocates of intellectual property pull these together and really take on how enamored we are with the creative parts and add it to the industrial parts, which is patent, and pull those together. The GATT Advisory Committee was a group that was created in terms of US trade law. And the GATT Advisory Committee on Trade Policy started to work in the context of the Uruguay Round, which was part of the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, in other words, international trade, nothing to do with intellectual property, nothing to do with medicines, but trade. And in that trade round, they campaigned to get intellectual property into the trade rules. Why did they do that? Well, they tried at WIPO, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, to get a minimum standard of protection, to get away from that national treatment rule. Their problem at WIPO is an organization internationally that has one vote, one nation. And so nations developing countries were not interested in that set of rules, and so they couldn't get it through there. And so they moved the whole debate away from WIPO, where intellectual property was supposed to be debated, into the trade rules. And in 1986, the whole issue of intellectual property was introduced into the Uruguay round, with a lot of pressure from the United States trade representatives and bilateral relations around the world, especially using what's called Section 301 of the US trade law, which basically allowed the US to put pressure on individual countries to step up to the plate and accept these heightened burdens of trade. A good example of that was Canada. NAFTA in 1993, we still have these dreams about the fact that medicines are cheaper in Canada. One of the reasons why they were cheaper was until 1993, the Canadians used compulsory licensing. In other words, they would take any product that came on the market in the United States, reverse engineer it, or take a license from a US company. Most of the US companies actually granted licenses, and under licensing in Canada would produce it at a much cheaper rate for the Canadian market only. And NAFTA, one of the last points in the debate about NAFTA was to get rid of that compulsory licensing premise in Canada. The Canadians replaced it with a price control mechanism, which is still the reason why things are slightly cheaper there still, but the basic production of pharmaceuticals was forced into the same structure or similar structure of patent control as in the United States. And finally, in 1994, you get the Intellectual Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. That agreement, TRIPS agreement, comes as part of the World Trade Organization. And in a break with a lot of what international law did until that point, the deal at the WTO in 1994 in Marrakesh was an all-or-nothing deal. Countries either accepted the whole package or they didn't accept it. You were either going to be part of the international trade relations and accept everything, or else you were going to be outside. That in GATT, in the previous arrangement, you could, as a country, choose to be parts of little bits of it. And whatever obligation you took, you owed to others and nothing else. But in WTO, it's an all-or-nothing deal. So it's a very important move internationally in terms of unifying the world around one set of standards. And it's into that they smuggled these intellectual property standards as well. There was a lot of objection on the way from Canada and from India and Brazil and a number of countries, but in the end they were persuaded that they'd get more benefit from the global trade regime that they didn't want to be out of than dealing specifically with the TRIPS issues. Well, there's another part of my story, and that's what I call 4 interconnected stories. You have the fact that antiretrovirals in 1996, when they arrive on the market, transform HIV/AIDS into a chronic illness. Before 1994, it was basically still a death sentence. The South African government adopted in 1994 a new drug policy that would have allowed compulsory licensing and parallel importation of drugs. Drugs at the time in South Africa were incredibly expensive. This was an idea to try and bring down the price and access. These were not connected things, right? These are 4 completely interconnected but separate stories. The South African drug policy came about because when the African National Congress took power in 1994, they had a policy to change the drug policy of the country to gain more access for poor people in the country to drugs. That was the idea. It had nothing to do with HIV/AIDS, but that's what they put on the table. The same year, though, they also changed the economic policy and adopted a neoliberal economic policy which relied on the idea that they would have more international foreign investment. And so they became, at the same moment that they were adopting this new drug policy, they became more sensitive to what the international capital community thought about investing in South Africa. And the fourth and final one, which is quite interesting, is they adopted a constitution, or we adopted a constitution at the time, that included a right to health as a justiciable socioeconomic right in the Constitution. So just like any of the rights in the Bill of Rights in the United States, there's a right to health in the South African Constitution. These 4 things all happen at the same time with dramatic consequences. Well, what does the impact of ARVs have? Well, that's a simple slide out of Canada, but I think it shows you why 1996 mattered. Right? Here is the death rate in Canada from AIDS. Until 1996, antiretrovirals arrive on the market, you get a dramatic fall-off. In South Africa, what happens in result of this understanding that there is now in the world the capacity to address this pandemic, and yet a government that's not moving, and international drug companies that are, at the time, the price was over $10,000 per year per patient for antiretrovirals. That would have been the price. And given a developing country, even South Africa is a fairly well-situated developing country, there was no ways the government could afford it even if it wanted at that price. The treatment action campaign that emerged then becomes a very important part of the story as it develops later. Where are we today? If you look globally today, those background blue bars is the number of people today who are living with HIV/AIDS in the world, which is approximately 35 million people. But what's interesting again is if you look at those other bars, the brown bar is people newly infected with HIV, and what's interesting is how that's dropping off over time. And the dark bar below is the deaths due to AIDS. That's also dropping off. So clearly the introduction of ARVs in the world is having an impact. We are not out of the woods at all with the pandemic, but there are changes. What about the access to drugs part? Well, here you see the impact of competition. If you see the lowest originator price in 2000 was $10,439 per year per patient. And when Brazil started producing for their own market domestically, because they did not have patent laws that applied to them at the time, it was $2,767 was the price at which they could produce. What you see very dramatically as a number of Indian companies come online, Hetero and Aurobindo and Cipla, is how the price gets forced down. By June 2010, Aurobindo and Cipla are providing the same drug for $67 per year per patient. For developing countries, the possibility of addressing this becomes very different when you change those economic structure in that way. There's, though, a downside to this. If you look at these, this is the first line drugs. Those are the prices per year for the WHO standard, a slightly better standard than that $67 per year. But if you look on the end, the best practice today in the world would be the 1,033. And that's still under patent. Right? So you see that still, and what we would do in the US today is we'd give that end one probably, or at least would lead up to that one as a first line. And yet, in the developing country, we expected to give these others. So there's also a tension in terms of what we expect to be delivering to other people who are sick as opposed to our people. And of course, the future shock is if you try and think of second or third line drugs, again, you now, with a third line possibility of 3,204, this becomes totally unaffordable. And this is no longer in a situation where we will see that same effect of competition from generics. What's changed is in 2005, India finally accepted the rigors of TRIPS. There's now nowhere in the world that can now just take a drug, reverse engineer it, and start producing it for the open market, as was the case before 2005. So that pattern of drugs prices dropping is unlikely to be repeated in the same way. There's other ways in which it might happen. But what about the legal developments since 1996? In 1997, 39 pharmaceutical companies, the global companies that you all know, decided to sue Nelson Mandela's government. What was really funny about it, of course, because he was president, he was the named first defendant. What a bad publicity stunt, right? Decide in 1997 to sue Nelson Mandela of South Africa. It didn't work very well for them. The international NGOs and that got very active around this, and it was a real black eye for the pharmaceutical corporations. Their lawyers had no idea. In 2001, as a result of this, we do get the Doha Agreement on TRIPS, and that agreement basically allows certain flexibilities. The flexibilities are very thin. They allow countries with no capacity to try and get drugs abroad. Effectively, they haven't worked. And one of the reasons they haven't worked is continuing through the 2006 agreement on compulsory licensing to today, the USA, the EU continue internationally to fight every attempt at using those flexibilities. Right at the moment, Novartis has been suing the Indians in India in court about the way they're using the TRIPS agreement in relation to the definition of patents. In Kenya, they're now using anti-counterfeiting as a reason to ban generic ARVs. So there's different ways, and the companies are constantly, for them, they essentially want to control the patents. That's their concern. Well, what's an alternative? One of the alternatives that's in place at the moment, and I'm quite critical of the idea that philanthropy can solve global issues like this, but one of the alternatives that's maybe a little more than philanthropy is this idea of unit aid. This is a group that's now, it's an international NGO, but it's actually a state-based organization that is based within the WHO. But it was created by Brazil, France, UK, and Norway coming together and creating a finance mechanism. And the finance mechanism basically for France, I think it's Air France, Brazil doesn't use it, Norway uses a separate system, but they use a tax on the airline. So if you fly Air France, part of your ticket price goes directly to unit aid. They're pooling this money, and they're using this money through the Clinton Foundation and other providers of drugs to bargain internationally for cheap drugs. So they're basically trying to use the market mechanisms to drive down the prices. It has it works to a certain degree. One of the questions, though, is they are limited. They've limited themselves to 3 diseases. And I found this fascinating. The 3 diseases are HIV/AIDS, malaria, and TB. These are important diseases, no question. But why should somebody who has cancer in Kenya not have access to cheaper medicines? How can you justify just these 3 diseases and not the rest? But that's what they've insisted upon, and in fact the pharmaceutical companies and the developed countries have been insisting upon that since 2000, since the debate over the Doha Agreement. They try to limit that just to those 3 diseases, while the developing world and the rest of the world is saying, no, this actually should apply to all diseases. This is a public health issue. This is not a question of patents and property. Well, I want to take it one step further, and let's leave it there for the moment. And that is raise the question, we'll go on. Raise the question of, how are we related to it right here on this campus? Well, we are related. Our scientists have produced many patents. Our patents are held by WARF, and our WARF patents are licensed to the pharmaceutical companies, to many others as well, but in part to pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that a student movement around this campus, not on this campus, but around the country has been doing for a while now, has been suggesting that when we license, when universities license, that in our licenses we could require certain conditions on our licensees. And one of the interesting conditions that's now a possibility is since October last year, Unit Aid has created a patent pool. They are asking the pharmaceutical companies to pool patents for the drugs related to HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. And so those patents, once pooled, can be used, licensed out to the Ciplers of the world, to the Indian companies, etc., that can produce these drugs at a much cheaper rate than what we're prepared to do here. Now, what we hope will happen is the pressures from that would push these companies to start licensing the drugs themselves under their own control to generic producers who can produce them cheaper and provide them cheaper. Thank you.